The Midnight Visitor. It started on a rainy Tuesday evening. Emily had just moved into her new apartment, a compact but cozy one-bedroom unit on the edge of town. The rent was cheap, the neighborhood quiet, and most importantly, it was a fresh start. She'd left behind a toxic relationship and was ready to rebuild her life. But something about the place felt off. The first few nights passed uneventfully. Emily settled in, unpacked her boxes, and decorated the apartment to her liking. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, a side effect of being alone for the first time in years. But then, small things began to happen. One night, as she sat on the couch watching TV, she heard a faint scraping sound coming from the kitchen. It was subtle, almost like nails lightly dragging across the floor. She paused the show, straining to listen, but the sound stopped. "It's just the building," she muttered to herself. "Old pipes or something." But as the days went by, the noises grew more distinct. Footsteps, a creaking floorboard, the sound of a door handle jiggling. Emily double-checked her locks every night and even wedged a chair under the doorknob for extra security. Still, the feeling of unease persisted. One Friday evening, after a long day at work, Emily decided to take a hot shower to relax. The bathroom filled with steam as she let the water wash away her stress. She closed her eyes, enjoying the moment, but then she heard it, a soft knock on the bathroom door. Her heart froze. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. She turned off the water and strained to listen. Nothing. Wrapping herself in a towel, she slowly opened the door and peered out into the hallway. The apartment was silent. She checked every room, even the closet. No one was there. That night, she barely slept. Every creak and groan of the building set her on edge. She finally drifted off around 3 a.m., only to be jolted awake by the sound of her bedroom door creaking open. She bolted upright, her eyes darting to the doorway. The room was pitch black, but she swore she saw a shadow move. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Silence. Emily grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, illuminating the empty doorway. She got up, checked the lock on her front door, and found it secure. Was she losing her mind? The next day, she installed a security camera in her living room. If something was happening, she'd have proof. That night, Emily went to bed feeling somewhat reassured by the camera. She fell asleep quickly, exhaustion finally catching up with her. But around 2 a.m., she was awakened by the faint sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was a notification from the camera app. Motion detected. Her blood ran cold. Hands trembling, she opened the app and played the footage. The camera's infrared view showed her living room, dimly lit by the glow of the streetlights outside. At first, there was nothing. Then, a shadow moved across the screen. It wasn't fast or subtle. It was deliberate, as if someone was walking through the room. Emily stared at the screen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadow stopped near the camera and seemed to look at it. And then, just as suddenly, the feed went dark. She clutched her phone, paralyzed with fear. She didn't dare leave her room. She sat there, huddled under her blanket, until the first rays of sunlight streamed through her window. The next morning, she contacted the landlord and demanded the locks be changed. He complied, but seemed annoyed by her insistence. "This building's been here for decades," he said. "Never had a break-in. You're probably just imagining things." Emily wasn't convinced. She considered moving out but couldn't afford to break her lease. So she stayed, though she never felt safe again. A week later, Emily came home late from work. As she unlocked her door, she noticed something strange. The chair she always wedged under the doorknob was on the floor. Her stomach dropped. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the apartment. Everything looked normal, but there was an eerie stillness in the air. Then she saw it, a message scrawled on her bathroom mirror in red lipstick. "Why do you lock me out?" Emily stumbled back, her mind racing. She grabbed her phone and called the police. They arrived within minutes, searching the apartment thoroughly. But once again, they found no signs of forced entry. The officer in charge gave her a sympathetic look. "It's possible someone has a key," he said. "We'll keep an eye on the area, but you might want to stay somewhere else for a while." That night, Emily packed a bag and went to stay at a friend's house. She couldn't bear the thought of spending another night in that apartment. But as she lay in her friend's guest room, her phone buzzed again. Motion detected. She hesitated before opening the app. The footage showed her empty apartment, just as she left it. But then, the camera tilted slightly, as if someone had nudged it. A face filled the frame. A man's face, pale and expressionless, staring directly into the lens. Emily screamed, dropping the phone. By the time the police arrived, the man was gone. But he'd left something behind, a single photograph placed on her kitchen counter. It was a picture of Emily, sleeping in her bed. She never went back to that apartment. The roommate. When Sarah moved to the city for her new job, she carried a mix of excitement and nervousness, eager to start fresh, but apprehensive about being alone in an unfamiliar place. She didn't expect finding a place to live to be such a nightmare. She'd spent weeks scrolling through ads, meeting shady landlords, and touring dingy apartments. Then she found the listing. Roommate wanted, spacious apartment, great neighborhood, $500 a month. Too good to be true, she thought. But desperate times called for desperate measures. The apartment was everything the ad promised, a spacious, sunlit unit in a quiet building. The current tenant, Claire, was polite and welcoming, though a little distant. She was in her late 20s with sleek black hair and a minimalist sense of style. Claire's reserved nature didn't bother Sarah. In fact, it was a relief. She preferred to keep to herself anyway. The first few weeks were uneventful. Claire was often out, working long hours or spending time in her room. Sarah spent her evenings unpacking, decorating her space, and getting settled into her new routine. But as time went on, small, strange things began to happen. One evening, Sarah came home to find the kitchen sink filled with dirty dishes. It was odd because Claire seemed almost obsessively clean. Sarah shrugged it off, assuming Claire had been in a rush. But then there were other incidents. Lights left on in rooms neither of them had been in, doors that she swore she'd locked found ajar, and the faint sound of whispering late at night. "Do you hear that?" Sarah asked one morning as they both stood in the kitchen. "Hear what?" Claire replied, not looking up from her coffee. "It's like whispering at night. I thought it might be coming from outside." Claire's expression didn't change, but Sarah thought she saw the faintest flicker of something in her eyes. "It's probably just the pipes. This building's old," she said dismissively. Sarah wasn't convinced. The whispering was too deliberate, too human, but she told herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild in a new place. Then, one night, Sarah woke to the sound of her bedroom door creaking open. Her heart raced as she sat up, straining to see in the darkness. "Claire?" she called out. No answer. She got out of bed and turned on the light. The hallway was empty, and Claire's door was closed. Sarah shook her head, trying to convince herself it was just the draft. Still, she locked her bedroom door before going back to bed. The next morning, Sarah decided to confront Claire. "Hey, were you in my room last night?" Claire looked genuinely confused. Why would I do that?" Sarah felt a twinge of guilt. "I don't know. My door opened on its own. Maybe it was just the wind." Claire gave a small smile. "Probably. These old apartments can be weird like that. Despite Claire's reassurances, Sarah couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. She started noticing other things. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. Sometimes it sounded like her name being called. And Claire was acting strange. She became more reclusive, spending hours locked in her room. Once, Sarah caught a glimpse of her through the cracked door, sitting on her bed, staring at the wall as if in a trance. One evening, Sarah decided to investigate. Claire was out, and curiosity got the better of her. She pushed open the door to Claire's room and stepped inside. The air felt heavier, colder. The room was sparsely furnished, a bed, a nightstand, and a small desk. But the walls were covered in photographs. Sarah's breath caught as she realized the photos were all of her. Some were innocuous, like her walking down the street or sipping coffee by the window, but others were far more intimate. There were pictures of her asleep in her bed, her face lit eerily by the glow of her phone, and one of her brushing her hair in the bathroom mirror, a photo taken from the other side of the glass. Her skin crawled as she noticed some of the pictures had annotations, dates, times, and cryptic symbols scrawled in red ink. Her hands shook as she backed out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. Pictures of her walking to work, sitting in the living room, even sleeping in her bed. Some were taken from angles that suggested they'd been captured inside her room. Her hands shook as she backed out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. That night, Sarah barely slept. She locked her door and pushed her dresser in front of it for good measure. She needed to get out of the apartment, but it was late, and she didn't feel safe leaving alone. First thing in the morning, she told herself, she'd pack her things and leave. But morning never came. Sarah woke to a sound she couldn't place. Her eyes fluttered open, and she froze. Claire was standing at the foot of her bed, a knife glinting in her hand. "You should have stayed out of my room," Claire said softly, her voice eerily calm. Sarah scrambled backward, her mind racing. "Claire, please, let's just talk about this." "You don't understand," Claire interrupted, her eyes wild. "They told me you would ruin everything, but I won't let that happen." Sarah lunged for her phone on the nightstand, but Claire was faster. She grabbed Sarah's wrist and pressed the knife to her throat. "Shh," Claire whispered. "It'll be over soon." In a burst of adrenaline, Sarah kicked out, knocking Claire off balance. The knife clattered to the floor and Sarah bolted for the door. She ran out of the apartment and down the stairs, screaming for help. Neighbors opened their doors and someone called the police. By the time they arrived, Claire was gone. The apartment was empty, the photos from her room missing. The police took Sarah's statement, but without evidence, there was little they could do. She spent the night at a friend's place, too shaken to be alone. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah tried to move on. She found a new apartment, far away from the old one, but the unease never left her. Sometimes, she felt eyes on her in crowded places, and then, one day, she came home to find a single photograph on her kitchen counter. It was a picture of her, taken from outside her new apartment. She never saw Claire again, but she never felt safe either. Some nights, she still hears the whispering. The Forgotten Diary. When Daniel inherited his late uncle's house in the countryside, he thought it would be a peaceful retreat, a chance to escape the chaos of the city. The house was an old Victorian manor, its brick exterior weathered by years of neglect. Though the property felt isolated, surrounded by dense woods, Daniel saw it as an opportunity to start fresh. The first few days were uneventful. He spent most of his time cleaning, exploring the creaky old rooms, and unpacking his belongings. One morning, while organizing the attic, Daniel stumbled upon a small, leather-bound diary tucked inside a wooden chest. The leather was cracked and faded. the initials JW etched faintly into the cover. He guessed it must have belonged to his uncle or perhaps someone who had lived in the house before. Curious, Daniel opened the diary. The entries were written in neat, precise handwriting. They started innocuously enough: daily musings, descriptions of the weather, and notes about chores. But as he flipped through the pages, the tone shifted. The writer, presumably JW, began recounting strange occurrences in the house, unexplained noises, objects moving on their own, and the sense of being watched. The shadows are alive here. They linger longer than they should, stretching unnaturally in the lamplight. Last night, I heard whispers coming from the walls. I am not alone in this house. Daniel dismissed the entries as the ramblings of a paranoid mind. Still, there was something about the diary that unsettled him. He decided to leave it in the attic and focus on settling in. That night, Daniel was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway. He sat up, his heart pounding, and strained to listen. The house was silent. Probably just the old wood settling, he thought, though he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The following days brought more disturbances. Doors creaked open on their own, the lights flickered unpredictably, and he often felt a cold draft despite the summer heat. Each incident was small enough to dismiss, but together they formed an unsettling pattern. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the creaks of the old house. But as the nights passed, they grew louder, more distinct. The tone was low and guttural, like a chorus of voices speaking in a language Daniel couldn't understand. At times, he thought he could make out fragments. His name, whispered slowly, drawn out like a taunt. The whispers seemed to come from every corner of the room, enveloping him in an invisible, chilling presence. Late one night, as Daniel sat reading in the study, he heard them for the first time. Faint, indistinct murmurs seemed to drift from the walls. He froze, straining to make out the words, but they were too quiet, too fragmented. When he stood and pressed his ear to the wall, the whispers stopped. He tried to rationalize it. The wind, pipes, my imagination. But deep down, he knew better. A week later, while cleaning the dining room, Daniel noticed a section of the wallpaper peeling away. Curious, he pulled at the loose edge, revealing an old concealed doorway. The wood was warped, the doorknob rusted, but with some effort he managed to pry it open. Beyond the door was a narrow staircase leading downward. A faint, musty odor wafted up from the darkness. Grabbing a flashlight, Daniel descended cautiously. The stairs led to a hidden basement, a room he hadn't seen on the blueprints. The air was damp and heavy, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty jars and yellowed papers. In the center of the room stood a single wooden chair, its seat scratched and worn. On the floor beneath it were deep gouges, as if the chair had been dragged repeatedly across the concrete. Daniel's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. His breath caught when he saw the symbols. Strange, jagged markings were carved into the walls, forming a chaotic spiral that seemed to converge on the chair. The symbols matched those he'd seen scrawled in the margins of the diary. That night, Daniel dreamed of the basement. In his dream, he was sitting in the chair, unable to move. The walls around him seemed to pulse, the symbols glowing faintly. Shadows gathered in the corners, creeping closer as a low, guttural whisper filled the air. He woke drenched in sweat, his heart racing. Determined to put an end to the unease, Daniel decided to destroy the diary. He retrieved it from the attic and tossed it into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed the brittle pages. The fire flared unnaturally bright, and for a moment, he thought he heard a distant scream. Relief washed over him as the last of the diary turned to ash. But that night, the whispers returned, louder, and more insistent. They no longer came from the walls, but seemed to echo directly in his ears. "You shouldn't have burned it," they hissed. The disturbances escalated. Objects flew off shelves, doors slammed shut, and the temperature in the house plummeted. Daniel's reflection in the mirror began to distort, his face twisting into something unrecognizable. He barely slept, his mind unraveling under the constant assault. One evening, as he sat in the study clutching a glass of whiskey, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. A shadow, tall and indistinct, hovered in the doorway. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was suffocating. When he turned to face it, the shadow was gone, but the oppressive feeling remained. Desperate, Daniel decided to leave the house. He packed a bag and headed for the front door, but when he tried to open it, the knob wouldn't turn. The windows wouldn't budge either, as if the house itself was holding him captive. Panicked, he ran to the basement, hoping to find another way out. The chair was no longer in the center of the room. It had been moved to the corner, facing the wall. The spiral of symbols seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light. And then he heard it. A voice, low and gravelly, coming from the shadows. "You can't leave, Daniel. You're part of this now." The basement door slammed shut behind him, plunging the room into darkness. Daniel's screams echoed through the empty house, and then there was silence. Weeks later, the house was sold again, this time to a young couple looking for a quiet escape. In the attic, they found an old leather-bound diary. The initials DH were etched into the cover. The vanishing floor. When Emma moved into her new apartment in the heart of the city, she thought it was a dream come true. The building was an old Art Deco structure with intricate iron railings, marble floors, and a grand gilded elevator that hummed softly as it climbed to her floor. Her unit on the 6th floor was spacious yet cozy, with large windows that overlooked the bustling streets below. She was particularly drawn to the building's charm and history. Built in the 1920s, it had been a hotel before being converted into apartments. The concierge, Mr. Graham, was an elderly man who had worked there for decades. "There's a lot of history in these walls," he told her, with a cryptic smile when she first moved in. "But not all history is worth remembering." Emma brushed off his comment as eccentricity. She loved her new home and quickly settled in, decorating the space with books, plants, and warm lighting. But as the days passed, she began noticing strange things. It started with the elevator. One evening, after returning late from work, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the 6th floor. The ride was smooth, the faint hum of machinery lulling her into a moment of peace. But when the elevator door slid open, she didn't recognize the hallway. The lights were dim, flickering as if struggling to stay on. The wallpaper was different, faded and peeling, revealing cracked plaster beneath. The air felt heavy, carrying a damp, musty smell. Confused, Emma checked the number etched beside the door. It read 5th floor. She frowned. She was certain she'd pressed 6. The button for her floor was still lit, but the elevator remained motionless. She pressed it again. Nothing. Her confusion turned to unease as she stepped back inside, repeatedly pressing the button. With a jolt, the elevator moved upward and stopped on the 6th floor. When the doors opened, her familiar hallway was there, warm and well lit. Shaking her head, she chalked it up to an old building's quirks. The next incident came a few nights later. Emma woke abruptly at 3:13 a.m., her heart racing. She wasn't sure why she'd woken up, but she had the distinct feeling of being watched. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the city outside. She got up, checked the locks on her door and windows, and crawled back into bed, her unease lingering. The next morning, she noticed something odd. A single red thread was stretched taut across her living room floor, as if someone had strung it between two corners. She didn't own red thread, and she lived alone. Her pulse quickened as she carefully picked it up, finding no sign of how it had gotten there. Over the next week, Emma became increasingly aware of small, unsettling changes. The plants in her living room began wilting, their leaves yellowing despite her care. The temperature in the apartment would fluctuate wildly, one moment stiflingly hot, the next bone-chillingly cold. The smell of dampness lingered in the air, no matter how often she opened the windows. Her dreams turned vivid and bizarre. Each night, she found herself standing in the flickering, decrepit hallway of the 5th floor. The walls seemed to close in around her, and from the shadows, she would hear faint whispers. The voices were indistinct, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. One evening, she decided to investigate. She took the elevator to the 5th floor, determined to prove to herself that it was just a normal hallway. The moment the doors opened, her breath hitched. It was exactly as she had seen in her dreams, dimly lit with peeling wallpaper and an overwhelming sense of decay. She stepped out cautiously. The air was colder here, and the silence was oppressive. The doors lining the hallway were old, with tarnished brass numbers that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loudly. At the end of the hallway, she saw a door slightly ajar. A faint light spilled out, flickering like candlelight. Her heart raced as she approached. Pushing the door open, she found an empty room. In the center stood an old round table with a single chair. On the table lay a small photo album. Emma hesitated before picking it up. The photos were black and white, depicting people she didn't recognize. They were dressed in 1920s attire, smiling stiffly for the camera. As she flipped through, her unease deepened. The last photo was of her, standing in the flickering hallway of the 5th floor, her expression frozen in terror. She dropped the album and bolted back to the elevator. It took what felt like an eternity for the doors to close, and as they did, she swore she saw a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway, watching her. From that night on, the whispers grew louder. They followed her throughout the apartment, echoing her name in low, gravelly tones. She stopped sleeping, too afraid to close her eyes. Mr. Graham, noticing her haggard appearance, pulled her aside one morning. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked gravely. Emma stared at him, unsure how to respond. He nodded knowingly. "The 5th floor. It's not supposed to exist. They bricked it up years ago after the fire, but sometimes it comes back." He handed her a small weathered key. "If it calls you again, you have to lock the door." That night, Emma's dreams returned, more vivid than ever. She was back on the 5th floor, standing before the door with the faint light. This time, the door creaked open wider, revealing not an empty room, but a yawning darkness. She woke with a start to find the red thread stretched across her living room once more, leading directly to her front door. Summoning all her courage, she grabbed the key and stepped into the hallway. The elevator stood open, its button for the 5th floor glowing faintly. She didn't remember calling it. With trembling hands, she stepped inside. When the doors opened, the hallway was darker than ever, the whispers louder, almost deafening. Emma approached the door at the end, the key heavy in her hand. The light spilling out was no longer soft, but harsh and flickering like a strobe. Shadows moved within, writhing and indistinct. She stepped inside and turned the key in the lock. As the tumblers clicked into place, the shadows surged toward her. The building's residents found her apartment empty the next morning. Emma had vanished without a trace. The only clue was a red thread stretched taut across her living room, leading to the elevator. Weeks later, A new tenant moved into the unit. On their first night, they awoke at 3:13 a.m. to the sound of faint whispers. The unmarked box. When Claire first moved into her inherited home on the outskirts of town, she had no intention of staying long. The house, a modest, single-story structure surrounded by overgrown trees, had belonged to her estranged grandmother. It was a place filled with childhood memories she'd rather forget. But financial struggles left her no choice, and so she packed her life into boxes and moved into the creaky old house. The first few weeks were uneventful. Claire spent her days cleaning, sorting through the hoarded belongings her grandmother had left behind, and working remotely. One evening, while organizing the basement, she came across a large, unmarked wooden box shoved into a dark corner. It was heavy, the wood warped and splintered with age. Curiosity got the better of her, and she dragged it into the dim light of a single hanging bulb. The lid creaked as she pried it open, releasing a faint smell of mildew and something metallic. Inside were several items: a tattered leather journal, an old brass key, and a cracked porcelain doll. The doll's glass eyes stared blankly ahead, and its once rosy cheeks were faded and chipped. Claire shuddered but picked up the journal. The pages were filled with tight, uneven handwriting. It was written by someone named Eleanor, her grandmother's name. The entries started innocently enough, describing day-to-day life, but quickly grew erratic. The doll arrived today. It's beautiful, but there's something unsettling about it. It's as if it's watching me. I've begun to hear noises at night, scratching from the walls. The doll's position changes when I'm not looking. I locked it in the box, but the noises haven't stopped. There's something here, something I brought into this house. Claire closed the journal, her skin crawling. She glanced at the doll, its lifeless gaze fixed on her. It's just a toy, she told herself, though her pulse quickened. She decided to leave the box and its contents in the basement. That night, Claire woke to the sound of faint scratching. At first, she thought it was a branch against the window, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and strained to listen. The scratching stopped. Morning brought some relief, though Claire couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She chalked it up to her imagination and spent the day unpacking. But as she entered the living room, she froze. The porcelain doll was sitting on the coffee table. Claire's mind raced. She was certain she'd left it in the basement. She picked it up gingerly, trying to suppress the growing dread. The doll felt heavier than it should have, and its once blank expression seemed subtly altered. Its lips curved into the faintest hint of a smirk. By the third night, the noises had escalated. It wasn't just scratching anymore. There were faint whispers, unintelligible but unmistakably there. Claire began sleeping with the lights on, though it offered little comfort. The whispers seemed louder in the light, as if mocking her attempts to feel safe. Desperate for answers, Claire turned to the journal. Eleanor's writing became more frantic in the later entries. The key. I don't know where it came from, but it fits the small door in the cellar. I made the mistake of opening it. I've tried to get rid of the doll, but it always returns. I hear it laughing at me in the dark. It wants something. It wants me. Claire's hands trembled as she flipped through the final pages. One entry was particularly chilling. If you find this, don't use the key. Don't open the door. Burn the box. Burn it all. That night, Claire was awoken by a loud thud. She bolted upright, clutching her blanket. The sound had come from the basement. Gripping a flashlight, she made her way downstairs. The box was no longer in its corner. It had been dragged to the center of the room, the lid slightly ajar. The brass key lay on top, as if daring her to use it. She knew she shouldn't, but something compelled her. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the key and moved toward the small door Eleanor had mentioned. It was hidden behind old crates, the wood warped and blackened with age. The key slid into the lock effortlessly. The door creaked open to reveal a narrow passage, the air thick with the stench of decay. At the end of the corridor was a small, dark room. Symbols were carved into the stone walls, their jagged lines pulsating faintly in the beam of her flashlight. In the center of the room stood a pedestal. On it was another doll, identical to the one in the box, but pristine, as if untouched by time. Its eyes seemed to follow Claire as she approached. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices urging her closer. As she reached out, the door slammed shut behind her. The flashlight flickered, plunging the room into near darkness. The whispers turned to laughter, cold, mocking, and endless. Claire was never seen again. When the house was sold months later, the new owners found an unmarked wooden box in the basement. Inside was a tattered leather journal, a brass key, and a single porcelain doll. The doll's face was different now, its lips curved into a full, sinister smile. The silent neighborhood. When Ethan moved into the small suburban community of Red Ash Hollow, he thought he'd found the perfect place to start over. The houses were charming and identical, with well-maintained lawns and white picket fences. The neighbors were polite but distant, and the streets were eerily quiet, even during the day. It was exactly what Ethan wanted, a peaceful escape from the chaos of his former life in the city. The first night in his new home passed uneventfully. Ethan unpacked boxes, arranged his furniture, and enjoyed the silence. But as he lay in bed, he began to notice something peculiar. There were no night sounds, no crickets chirping, no distant cars, not even the faint rustle of wind. The silence was absolute, pressing against his ears like a physical weight. The next morning, Ethan decided to explore the neighborhood. He walked past rows of identical houses, their curtains drawn, their driveways empty. He saw a man trimming his hedges and waved, but the man only nodded stiffly, his movements mechanical. Further down the street, a young woman watered her plants, her face blank and emotionless. "Nice weather today," Ethan called out. She paused, her hand gripping the watering can tightly. Without looking at him, she replied, "Yes, it's always nice here," then turned and went inside, leaving her plants half-watered. Something about her response unsettled him, but Ethan shook it off. People are just private here, he thought. That's all. A week passed, and Ethan began to notice more oddities. The lights in every house turned off at exactly 10 p.m. Every morning at 7 a.m., his neighbors emerged, performing the same tasks: watering plants, mowing lawns, retrieving mail with eerie precision. They never spoke unless spoken to, and even then, their answers were clipped and devoid of emotion. One evening, while unpacking the last of his boxes, Ethan found a small envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a note written in shaky handwriting. "Do not leave your house after midnight. Lock your doors. Keep your curtains closed. Trust no one." Ethan stared at the note, his stomach knotting. There was no signature, no explanation. He checked the locks on his doors and windows twice before going to bed that night, the note burning in his mind. At 12:15 a.m., Ethan was startled awake by a noise outside. It was faint at first, a soft tapping sound, but it grew louder and more deliberate. Curious and uneasy, he crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. The street was empty, bathed in the cold glow of a full moon. Then he saw them, figures moving between the houses, their shapes obscured by the shadows. They were slow and deliberate, their movements almost unnatural. Ethan's breath caught as one of the figures stopped in front of his house. It stood there, motionless, its head tilted upward as though staring directly at his window. He ducked behind the curtain, his heart racing. The tapping began again, this time at his front door. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Ethan confronted one of his neighbors, an older woman named Mrs. Harper who lived across the street. "Do you know anything about the people walking around at night?" he asked. Her eyes flickered with fear, but she quickly masked it. "You shouldn't concern yourself with things like that," she said. "We all follow the rules here. You should too." "What rules?" She hesitated, her hands trembling. "Just stay inside and don't ask questions." Then she hurried back into her house, slamming the door behind her. Determined to get answers, Ethan decided to investigate that night. Armed with a flashlight and his phone, he stayed awake until midnight. The tapping began again, and this time, he opened the curtains fully. The same figures moved silently through the street, their heads tilted as though listening for something. Their faces were obscured, but their bodies looked distorted, as though they didn't quite belong in this world. Ethan crept to his back door and slipped outside, staying in the shadows. The air was thick and unnaturally cold, and the silence was deafening. He followed the figures at a distance, careful not to make a sound. They moved toward the edge of the neighborhood, where an old, overgrown path led into the woods. The path ended at a clearing where a large stone circle was embedded in the ground. The figures gathered around it, their heads still tilted, as if in silent communication. Ethan's flashlight flickered, and a wave of nausea washed over him. He stumbled, drawing their attention. Dozens of heads snapped toward him, their faces now visible. They were blank and featureless, with empty black sockets where eyes should have been. Ethan froze, his blood turning to ice. The figures began to move toward him, their movements no longer slow but swift and predatory. Ethan turned and ran, his flashlight swinging wildly. He could hear them behind him, their footsteps unnervingly synchronized. He burst back into his house, slamming the door and locking it. The tapping began immediately, louder and more insistent than before. The next morning, Ethan's house was eerily quiet. The note on his table had changed. "You've been marked. You cannot leave." Panic set in. Ethan packed a bag and drove toward the highway, but every road looped back to Red Ash Hollow. He tried calling for help, but his phone had no signal. Even the radio played only static. The neighbors now watched him from their yards, their blank faces turned in unison as he drove past. That night, Ethan heard the tapping again. This time, it came from every window and door. Shadows slid beneath the cracks, and the air grew cold. When he opened his eyes the next morning, he was no longer in his bed, but in the stone circle in the woods. The figures surrounded him, their featureless faces looming above. Ethan's screams echoed through the trees, but no one in Red Ash Hollow stirred. The next day, the house was listed for sale again, and a young couple, eager for a quiet life, decided it was just what they needed. And so, the truth remains hidden in the shadows, waiting for the next curious soul to uncover its secrets. Each story you've just heard is a chilling reminder that the unknown is closer than we think. Just one step, one decision away. If you enjoyed these tales of suspense and horror, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for even more terrifying stories. Hit the like button if this sent chills down your spine, and let us know in the comments which story haunted you the most. Your support helps us create more bone-chilling content, and the more you engage, the faster we'll bring you new horrors to uncover. So, join us, if you dare, and keep the darkness alive.